Hi, I'm Kip McClurg, one of the pastors at Vestavia Hills United Methodist Church, and we're so grateful that you've decided to participate in Disciple Bible. Now, I'll be providing for each session several different video clips teaching about what's going on in your Disciple Bible study manual. But to truly understand and participate in Disciple, you have to understand that what I say or the teachings that I am giving through video are not really how Bible study happens. It happens when a group of people get together who look together at God's Word and find a guide such as a book like this that helps them together to find out what God is saying. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't purchased one of these or gotten one of these, to find the study manual on Disciple. And the leader of your group should have the leader's guide as well. But I welcome you to this experience, and I look forward to being with you each session. In episode 8 and lesson 8 of Disciple Bible Study in the book of Luke and Acts, we continue journeying through the book of Acts. And we are learning some of what's happening kind of internally in the church. The church started in Jerusalem. It was there, but Jerusalem struggled with the Roman Empire and with a famine. And so persecution begins, and there's a lot of stress happening there. And so when stress happens, people kind of get irritable and can get harder to deal with. In chapter 6 in Acts, we see that the church was helping widows, but some of the Hellenists, and that word you probably know means someone who is from the Greek culture. So some of the Greek widows were complaining about unequal treatment for those of Jewish heritage. So they're saying, look, we're not being treated fairly. And ultimately that led to the creation of the group of deacons who did things that the disciples didn't have time to do because they were trying to preach. But the big question that came to a head is, as more and more people who are Greek in background and not Jewish, is can you be a follower of Jesus without first becoming a Jewish person? Which would mean that you have to be circumcised if you're male and follow all of the Jewish laws and all of the dietary laws. Those would have been foreign things for somebody who was not Jewish. It would have been a very normal part of Jewish life. But for someone from a totally different culture, that's strange. And so the question becomes, can you follow Jesus and not ultimately first become a Jew? The Jerusalem church was being led by James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, and it was becoming more and more preservationist. In other words, you had to be Jewish. We can't think new thoughts about this. We're going to stay and preserve what has been. We then come to chapter 7, and Stephen is a deacon who was asked to help serve, not an apostle, but kind of the next generation of leaders. He is the first martyr of the Christian faith, and he is killed when he starts preaching, basically saying that we are Jewish people, arguing with the Jewish council and accusing them of misleading Israel and killing its prophets, including Jesus. He was ultimately arguing that to follow Jesus is the fulfillment of what Judaism ought to be, and that they needed to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. But the Jewish council was not buying that argument at all, and they were infuriated. Not terribly different sermon than Peter had preached not long ago, but ultimately he was stoned, and so the Jewish people of Jerusalem are becoming more preservationist, but so does the church in Jerusalem ultimately. The persons stoning them, their coats were held by a man by the name of Saul of Tarsus, who would later be called Paul. And so really bad and tragic things began to happen in Jerusalem. Now, there were more moderating Jewish people. We mentioned Gamaliel earlier, and he was considered sort of a person who tried to find a mediating position between the Christian sect and the more preservationist Jewish sect. He encouraged the Jewish leaders to not pursue persecution, but let things just kind of die out, or if they were real, that they would continue on. Many Jews had already started fleeing Jerusalem and had nearly a generation of Greek life. They were used to being amphibious, both Jewish but compromising to live in a world that did not cater to Judaism. So a lot of those people would come back for festivals, like at Pentecost. They were Jewish, but they were also living in other cultures. But as more and more people had to leave Jerusalem, the question of, do we live the life that we live in Jerusalem without the temple, is that critical to being a Jew? And for Christians, is it critical to being a Christian? And many Christians were indeed scattered after Stephen's death. And Luke sees this scattering as the key event to the explosive growth of the church. Suddenly, these Christians were going everywhere, and they were empowered by the Holy Spirit, and they were sharing the story. Sometimes we see negative things happen in a church or in a country, I often hear people say, well, if this doesn't happen politically or that doesn't happen politically, then it's going to hurt the church. The church has grown the most when it has been the least accepted politically. The earliest days of the church, the first 5 centuries, the explosive growth that happened, it wasn't even legal to have a church building. The first church buildings didn't come around until the 4th century. And so the church grew because and in spite of the persecution. And so it's important for us to remember that negative things that can happen, challenging, surprising things, can be both a threat, but they can also be a great opportunity. And Luke certainly understood that the persecution in Jerusalem became the opportunity for the church to expand. Philip is a very good example of this. He left Jerusalem and went to Samaria in chapter 8. He had many conversions and had great success there in his ministry. And so this is the beginnings of the scattering of the church. And in the rest of the book of Acts, we'll see them go much further and much further. One of the people that we all have heard of is Paul, but he didn't start out with the name Paul necessarily. His Hebrew name is Saul, and as he began traveling in the Hellenistic world, he would more often use his Greek form of his Greek name, which was Paul. His full name would have been Saul Paulus of Tarsus. He was a Roman citizen, which gave him the privilege of being able to travel the entire Roman Empire as he pleased. Jesus and many of the other disciples did not have that privilege, and so they kind of stayed where they were. But Paul could travel freely. His family were Jewish people living, originally in Tarsus, but it appears that they sent him back to study with Gamaliel, and there he got a premier education in Jewish law and became a Pharisee. He was educated at the right schools, and he was very zealous to follow God and persecute the members of this new Christ follower sect. And he would actually chase them down, find out where they lived, and he had written permission through the Roman government and through the Jewish leaders to drag them back to Jerusalem for trial for basically doing negative things and destroying the faith. So Paul becomes this very feared person. He literally has the power to ruin your life. And if you're a follower of Jesus, he can have you dragged back and ultimately executed. But one day Paul was walking and he was blinded by a very bright light. And he had this revelation of Jesus, and he perceived it as a literal experience of the crucified Lord. And Jesus asked him, Paul, why are you persecuting me? And at that moment, the old phrase comes from here. He was literally blinded by the light, and it changed his life. He ultimately would let 3 years pass before returning to Jerusalem and to try to confer and fellowship with the Jerusalem church leaders. They were still struggling to get beyond the confines of traditional Judaism. And remember, they're preserving the Christian church as first Jewish. But Saul, who has been outside of Jerusalem now for most of his life, comes to them and says, "Look, there are people who are joining up with Jesus who have never heard of Judaism. They're not converting to that, but they're following Jesus and they're making great disciples. So what are we going to do about that?" And so he travels back to Jerusalem for a council. Paul joined up with another Hellenized Jewish Christian from the island of Cyprus named Barnabas. We talked about him a little earlier. The church in Antioch, which is now in Syria, was strong, and Barnabas was respected by the Jerusalem conservatives and by other churches around the Mediterranean. Barnabas had a teenage cousin named John Mark, and he was young, very young man then, and he is considered to be the person who wrote the book of Mark. And if you know about the Synoptic Gospels, Mark is kind of the basis of Matthew and Luke's books as well. And so this young man is traveling with all of these early leaders of the church. He's a teenager, and that ultimately gets in a little trouble because he gets scared. He doesn't want to get killed, and so he kind of goes back home. And at some point, he and Barnabas and Paul sort of get flustered over that, and Paul doesn't want him on other journeys. But for a while, John Mark travels with Paul and Barnabas together. Now, a watershed moment happens for Christianity when a Greek proselyte to Judaism was praying, and God told him where Peter was staying. He invited them to the house, to his home in Caesarea. Now, Peter was staying at the home of Simon the tanner, and while praying on his roof, he has this vision of a sheet full of animals, of all kinds of clean and unclean animals, lowered by a sheet from, it says, the four corners of the heavens. And in biblical terminology, that means all of the universe. And the vision encouraged Paul to eat all of these animals. Well, that was completely opposed to the Jewish law. You didn't eat those kind of animals. So this vision that's happening to Peter, as he's having that, he hears word from this other man named Cornelius to come and visit. And he talks with Cornelius, and Peter begins to process, okay, well, is it really necessary to be Jewish to be a follower of Jesus? And he'd been able to travel a little bit now and had met up with other people. He had this vision. And so Peter begins to change his mind. But when he goes back to Jerusalem, the conservative group rejects it and rebukes Peter. I mean, what are you doing staying in the home of a Gentile? Why did you stay with Cornelius? I mean, you don't do that. That's breaking the Jewish law. And so this council kind of convenes, early council of the leaders of the church, realizing that this problem was not going away and that the power of the church was leaving Jerusalem because Jerusalem was falling apart. And so a compromise was reached. One was, if you're a follower of Jesus, you could not eat meat sacrificed to idols. So if you lived in a pagan city and there was meat, if it had been sacrificed at an altar and then sold, you could not eat that. That was inappropriate. You couldn't drink blood or eat animals whose blood was not properly drained. In other words, you need to be kosher with how you eat your meats. And then sexual promiscuity was unacceptable. In many of these cultures, human sexuality was expressed in a lot of religious cults and a lot of other ways. And they said, if you're going to follow Jesus, human sexuality is reserved really in the marriage situation. And so you cannot participate in these kind of activities if you're going to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And so this becomes the model for how people who were not Jewish could follow Jesus and be a true disciple of Jesus Christ. I'm grateful that they worked through some of those difficult moments because it allows people like you and me to be a follower of Jesus and to like catfish and barbecue. So thankfully they worked through that, and all of us now can follow Jesus without having to prescribe to the Jewish law. Well, let's pause now and consider some of these ideas and the questions that are before you.